Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to November's webinar, which is Patch-22, How to Protect Your Organisation When You Can't Patch Everything. We've got one of our penetration testers doing this today, which is Tom Barber. He hasn't done one before, so this is his debut one. And I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes, just for the final few people to join, and then I'm going to hand over to Tom. So I'll just go quiet for a moment. Seem to have an influx all at once, so I'm going to hand over the reins to Tom now. And if you have any questions as Tom goes through, just send them using the chat or questions box, and we'll make sure that they're answered at the end. So I won't waste any more of your time, and I'll hand you over to Tom. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Patch-22. I'm going to be showing you how to protect your organisation when you can't patch everything. So I am Tom Barber. I am a penetration tester in the CST team, and I've been with Clarinet for 2 years. So before this, I was a university student, and this is my first post-uni job. My day-to-day usually ranges from testing and verification of the clients, but then I also like to develop scripts or programs to help the CST team. Automation's always nice. I'm currently specialised in web app testing, but I also like to dabble in hardware, automotive, and reverse engineering type stuff in my free time. So in this webinar, I'm going to be going over CVSS scores. I'm going to say what they are, how these scores are worked out, and kind of how they're not the be all and end all. I'm going to cover the top 5 most common high impact vulnerabilities that we've identified in CST. I'm going to talk about their root cause. I'm going to talk about how they're exploited and the impact of successful exploitation. And I'm also going to share some examples that we've identified. And then I will also cover remediation advice towards the end, and then we can ask and answer some questions. So picture this, you just had your penetration test and you've received your report. You hope it's all clear, but unfortunately, some vulnerabilities have been identified. So now you need to get to work to fixing these issues, and where do you begin? I think the most common approach that people use would be the CVSS score, and they'll go for the highest one and work the way down. And I think that makes sense on the surface, you know, it's a high score, it must be worse. But I don't think it's completely efficient. So to kind of work out if it is efficient or if there's better ways, I think it's important that we fully understand what the CVSS score is beyond its colour scheme. So CVSS, or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, is a way to measure the severity of a specific vulnerability. And while the CVSS score measures the severity, it does not take into account risk. Now, it's just getting quite wordy, and it's a lot to take in, so I think we should take a step back and actually understand what is risk and what is severity. So severity, that is the impact of the risk should it happen, and risk, that is the possibility of suffering harm or loss. So with that, CVSS is a measure of how bad the vulnerability is, but it doesn't take into account the possibility of the vulnerability being exploited. So looking back at our current strategy that we're using, we're fixing vulnerabilities by how serious they are, which again, it seems like it makes sense. But then we also have to think that not all vulnerabilities have the same possibility of being exploited, and there's multiple reasons behind that. Let's say you have a vulnerability on, you know, your internal network, it's isolated, employees might only have access. The chance of that being exploited compared to something facing on the internet is much different, because much more people are able to access internet-facing devices versus your internal network. There's also factors such as the vulnerability age. As vulnerabilities get older, they might fall out of prevalence. I think there's kind of a sweet spot when vulnerabilities are first identified that they're in the news, everyone knows about them, and I suspect that more people are going to try and go for them as proof of concepts and write-ups are moving about. So with all this information, I think the logical approach would be to patch your vulnerabilities that have the largest probability of being exploited rather than just working off how severe they are. Okay, so we've got our new idea here. I think we should try patching vulnerabilities by the probability. But now we need to figure out how are we actually going to measure probability, because we've got the plan, but how do we measure probability? It's the big question. Well, when CSC identify a vulnerability, we usually assign it an impact rating and a probability rating, which is separate from the CVSS score. We derive this rating from our knowledge of the vulnerability, kind of where we found it, what component we found it on, how we think it could possibly be chained, and create a heavier impact vulnerability with that. So coming up, I'm going to give examples of the top 5 high impact vulnerabilities that we identified this year. I'm going to cover their root cause, how they were exploited, by who, and the impact. Sorry, just a moment. Just have to clear my throat. So yeah, I'm going to talk about some vulnerabilities, how they're exploited, the impact, and I'll also cover some real-world examples that we've identified, and I'll talk about what rating we gave them and why we thought that they deserved that rating. So with that, I'll move on to the first vulnerability. So first we have vulnerable software. I'm going to call it outdated software because I will say vulnerable a lot, and yeah, it's very repetitive, and yeah, so I'm going to call it outdated software, but it's vulnerable software. So outdated software is caused by researchers or hackers finding security holes in the software. So one way or another, the software vendor finds out about this, and then they'll create a patch, and that patch will fix the issues that were identified. So if you fall behind on these patches, it can leave your software in a vulnerable state. I think it's quite easy to fall behind on software patches, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. You might be running mission critical software that works with a specific patch, and you don't want to risk updating it and then break the system, especially if it's mission critical. You might be overwhelmed with updates. Computers these days, they run a lot of different programs, and it can get quite overwhelming to boot up your program, have to do an update. It's just constant updates. Or it could be that you're running some really obscure software. You might have compiled something from GitHub and just might not be aware that there's more updates for it or security issues related to it. So outdated software is quite a broad area, and there's multiple vulnerabilities that can have different effects. You've got denial of service, path traversal, RCE, authentication bypasses, and the list goes on. In general, outdated software can be exploited by anyone that can interact with a software, provided they meet specific criteria. Some exploits might need specific permission levels. Some could just be exploited by anyone that can access the software. I think if there's proof of concept code or write-ups that are available, then that could also have an impact, as this opens up to less knowledgeable attackers. But if there isn't a proof of concept, the risk is still there, as the more knowledgeable hackers are able to view a patch, reverse engineer it to understand what it is that's changing, and then from that, understand how to exploit it. So yeah, outdated software is quite a broad category, and it can have different impacts based off the vulnerability that we're actually talking about specifically. They're not all equal, and some could be more devastating than others. What your organization does. So let's say you're an organization that values availability above all else. You might find that denial of service vulnerabilities are more incapacitating compared to anything else. And how secure your organization is as a whole. So if your network's locked down, if an attacker takes over one machine, it's not ideal, but then they're not running rampant inside your network. They've got more hacking to do and breaking into things before they can cause more damage. And if you compare that to where they get into one machine and they have free reign over your network. In terms of business impacts, we'll say for a worst case scenario, you could be looking at remote code execution, and that could lead to a complete system compromise. Depending what is on the system, they could steal, modify, or delete data. If that's customer data, this is much worse. Your business availability could be affected, and also your business rep. If client data does get modified, deleted, or stolen, then you also open yourself up to some legal action, let's say GDPR, for example. And here is 2 examples of outdated software that we have identified. So we have the Cisco vulnerability, and that was a file retrieval. So in this first instance, we gave it a probability of high, and the reason behind this was we were actually able to retrieve files ourselves. So, if we can say we can do it, then it's definitely there, and it's found by a scanner. So if our scanner can find it, there's a pretty good chance that the bad guy's scanner can find it too. Proof of concept code and write-ups were very easy to find for this, so it was easy to repeat. In the second instance, we have an Apache Tomcat vulnerability. And while RCE kind of looks quite threatening, once you get into the details of this vulnerability, it isn't too bad. And that's why we gave it a low probability of exploitation. So it only works on Windows. So immediately you've kind of limited what you could possibly attack. If you're running this on Linux, you're fine. And it's actually a vulnerable servlet inside of Apache that was affected. And that wasn't enabled by default. And we identified this vulnerability by the version number and not by being able to actually exploit it. So we can't say for sure that it's definitely vulnerable. But because we've identified it and we suspect it could be there, I think it's better that it gets reported, but then it's reported as a low probability. Next, on to cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting occurs when a hacker can inject code like JavaScript or HTML into a legitimate website. And then when the victim visits the site and the hacker's code becomes executed. There's many forms of cross-site scripting, and while the overall idea is the same, and that is that the hacker's code get executed, there's different forms of it, and it gets delivered in different ways. For example, with stored XSS, it's placed onto the server. So if you visit this website without clicking on any malicious links or anything like that, the code will still execute, compared to reflected, where you have to click on the URL and it's reflected back at you. So cross-site scripting can be exploited by anyone that's able to interact with a vulnerable input field and inject their malicious payload. So for example, let's say we have an error page on our website, and anyone can visit this if they kind of know what they're looking for. It might be 404.html. So if there's cross-site scripting in that, you can, well, anyone can visit it and you can send this link to anyone. In the case of DOM and reflected XSS, the payload is contained in the URL. So with that, a level of social engineering is also required to entice users to visit the malicious link, which can add a layer of complexity to this vulnerability. On the other hand, we've got stored XSS, which is stored on the website. So any user could visit this website and the malicious payload could execute. So you don't necessarily need to trick users into visiting it. So if an attacker is able to exploit cross-site scripting, there's a few things they can do with this. So they could modify how your website is presented and put new HTML into their payload. They could redecorate your website. They could, let's say if your website is a download site, we'll say VLC Media Player, for example. shout out to open source software. You could change the download link to point at your malicious file that you're serving compared to what users would expect. So when they visit this site and they click on this download link, they actually download your malware rather than the legitimate software that they expect. You can redirect users to another site. Depending on your motivation, you could direct users to a competitor for business impacts or to an attacker-controlled website, and then further attempt to try and trick them into entering credentials. In severe cases of XSS, you can steal user cookies, and then with that, you can impersonate and gain access to everything the end user had access to. For example, personal files, personal information, that sort of thing. In terms of business impacts, you're looking at compromised users, affected reputation, and possible legal action, because if personal information becomes affected, then again, GDPR comes into this. So here's two examples of cross-site scripting that were identified. In this case, they're both medium, and the reason for that is, well, with the first case, it was medium probability, and that was because we could replicate it, but it was reflected, so a level of social engineering would be required to trick a user onto clicking onto this URL. In the second case, it's now stored XSS, so that social engineering aspect is gone, but it was authenticated, so that kind of limits who can exploit this. And we identified this by version number because we didn't have creds to authenticate in this case. So that's why that was also a medium probability. So with SQL injection, your websites often use a database in the backend to function properly. Let's think of a shopping website, for example. So when you search for something on this shopping website, let's say a tin of baked beans, normally the results that match the tin of baked beans are returned. But the more crafty users might try and put SQL commands into the search bar in such a way that a different SQL query is created on the backend. And then from that, they could then perhaps view, access, or modify more data than what was originally intended. So SQL injection can be exploited by anyone that can interact with the affected input field. So again, looking at our shopping site, since we have no authentication on that because we want anyone to be able to look up things, that's kind of a wider audience versus an authenticated site. So successful exploitation can lead to a malicious actor accessing data that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. So as a mundane example, this could be more product listings that are on the website but aren't ready to be shown. In more serious cases, this could lead to database details, database contents, such as user creds being dumped. Depending on other factors, such as what permissions the SQL account is running with on the back end of the database, kind of affects how serious this could get. Let's say your SQL account is just read-only, then you're kind of limited in what you can do, because obviously you can't go around dropping files or deleting things. But if the permissions are more lax, then this could go on to complete system compromise. So SQL injection is generally pretty severe, no matter which way you kind of put it. Possible outcomes could be the hacker being able to read the database content, modification or deletion of the database, as said, and complete system compromise. The wider impact of the hacker being able to do SQLI is that a breach is very likely to follow. I think that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind when people hear about SQL injection is dumping the database. So this could then be sold online, or the criminal might use this for their own personal gain. The company is very likely to take a reputation hit for not securing the database contents. There's almost definitely going to be a legal aspect to this. You hear about it in the news all the time when a database gets leaked. And then customers are also going to possibly feel the impacts from this, as their data might be used for fraudulent activity, the credit card details might be stolen. So overall, SQL injection is not good. So here's two examples of SQL injection that we found. So in our first example, we were rating this a high probability, and the rationale behind that was it was an unauthenticated page, so anyone could access it. We were able to replicate it, and although it was time-based, which kind of adds a slight layer of complexity to it, it's still a very serious find, and you can still extract data with it. It just takes a little more time. With example 2, we gave this a lower probability because it was identified by software version again, and this also required admin privileges in order to take advantage of. And obviously, not everyone is running with admin privileges. So with broken access controls, the main cause of this is just that there is insufficient authorization checks when a user attempts to perform an action or access a resource. A good example of this is unauthenticated users performing actions only authenticated users should be able to perform. Although another example could be an authenticated user of a lower permission level performing actions of a higher level, although they shouldn't be able to. An attacker might know, or they might be able to guess kind of functionality or content that exists within an application. If you're using insecure IDs, they can kind of figure out what other resources might exist. And this can be done from an authenticated or unauthenticated perspective. Let's use the example of admin controls on my website, example.com. So the designer has intended that admin controls only be accessible to the admin. But then during testing, it wasn't identified that any authenticated user could actually access admin controls, and then from there, we're able to perform admin controls while not being an admin. The impact that you're looking at with broken access control depends on the kind of functionality that's affected. So generally, it could be things like users accessing one another's files or data, admin functions being performed by non-admin users, altering configuration files, so the website, and you could possibly bring that down. And then there's also the business reputation impacts here. Bethesda is while they didn't actually say how it was caused, I believe kind of how they described it is a good example of broken access controls. They were, back when Fallout 76 released, because that was a great release, there was a lot of people complaining and they wanted to refund the game. So they were submitting their refund requests to this website, and then on there, other users could view each other's complaint tickets and such. And I think that sounds like a good example of broken access control. So in our case study, we've got these two examples. The first one being high probability, and we said this was high probability because the user could authenticate as an admin by just using a username and a first name. So with that, once logged in, they could then update their account password without requiring the current password. And then from there, they could access other users' accounts. This one's quite interesting because it is also an example of weak authentication as well as broken access controls. And the weak authentication being that you could log in as an admin just using the name and the first name. In our second example, this was marked as a medium because the intentional functionality here was that you could view an email mailing list, and you could enable or disable people on the list. But it was found out that you could also add or remove people, although this wasn't intended. So this was put as a medium because it was quite simple to do, but then at the end of the day, it was just a mailing list, so it's not the end of the world. Unrestricted file upload. This occurs when a user quite simply uploads a file beyond what the developer intended, and it is that simple. Kind of dependent if there is more checks in place, testing can be a bit more complex, but for the most part, it is literally a case of, can I upload this file that isn't intended? So examples could be executables, maybe PDFs if you try and upload a picture, very large files. You just kind of upload things to see what you can do. So depending on your motivation, you might try to upload different files. So if we're trying to get an account onto the system, we might try to go for RCE. So with that, we might try uploading web shells, executables, things like that. Alternatively, if we're trying to slow down a crashed application, we might try large files to see if we can suck up some of that processing power. If we're trying to be a bit more deceptive and catch users out, then we might opt for macro-enabled documents and hope that the person on the other end opens these documents and then gets caught out by our macro. So in terms of impacts, you're looking at remote code execution, which could then lead on to full system compromise. In the case of macro-enabled docs, you might see more targeted attacks, which could be against higher privileged users. A user might try uploading unexpected content to try and bring down the site. If the website doesn't have proper error handling in place, then using a document that it doesn't expect could just cause it to crash. In the worst case scenario, if full system compromise, you're looking at things like a database leak, legal action, reputation hit, and this could go on to network compromise, kind of depending on how far they're able to compromise the system, what they can do with that. So in our case studies here, we have two vulnerabilities. The first one being rated as high. This one's a pretty interesting one because it exploits weak encryption in Telerik, and through that we're able to find out the admin key for this application. So from there was file upload functionality where we uploaded a web shell. In this case, we uploaded a web shell with hard-coded commands just because it was internet-facing and we didn't want a web shell facing the internet. Although I think it is fair to say that this could have gone on to full system compromise. In our second example, you were required to be authenticated with an account issued by an admin, so you couldn't just sign up. Once authenticated, in order to exploit this vulnerability, you're required to use a template, so it wasn't just accepting any file. Some checks were carried out, like file size and file extension, but it's possible to upload the ICAR test string into the file, so we could tell that there was no content checking here. Okay, and with that, on to remediation. So with the outdated software, first and foremost, I think it's important that you update your software systems as and where you can. If you can't update your system, going back to our example of mission critical, then you want to take action to isolate that system. If it's possible, put it into a virtual environment. You can check if exploit or proof of concept code exists. I think if they're more readily available, then the chance of exploitation is higher. So with cross-site scripting, you want to filter any input from untrusted sources, which will be our end users in this case. And then we want to also encode output as we send it out so it isn't interpreted wrongly by the browser. And you want to apply the appropriate HTTP response headers since they can help mitigate XSS. With SQL injection, you want to escape input from untrusted sources, which again is our end user. And then by doing so, it will then be interpreted correctly by the backend and the user can't break out the query. It's also a good idea to use parameterized queries so that if the user puts in a payload, it's added into this query as a parameter and it isn't interpreted as SQL. So no SQL injection is possible there. Broken access controls. So you want to thoroughly test the access control mechanism in place. And it's good practice to kind of do this as you're developing rather than develop this big shiny application and then just kind of throw access control into it at the end. Where IDs are used, you want to avoid using insecure IDs. You know, things like sequential numbers or IDs that repeat when they shouldn't. I actually had a test with broken access controls, and they were using hashes as their IDs, which is way better than just sequential numbers. But I was able to notice that these hashes were repeating almost as if they were hashing sequential numbers. So it made things more difficult, but I was able to kind of see a pattern emerging here, and able to do something with that. And the solution in that example also would have been to use one-time IDs rather than repeating hashed IDs. So with file upload, you want to carry out checks on what the user is uploading to your service. So you could limit the file size. If they're uploading a profile picture, there's absolutely no reason this picture should be 2 gigabytes. You could whitelist specific file types. So again, with the picture example, you wouldn't expect anything that isn't an image file to be uploaded. So I think it's fair to just whitelist image file types. And you can also check the contents. So if a user is uploading something resembling malware or a shell, then I don't think it's outlandish to say that that's not allowed and block that. And then also there's generic remediation advice. So I would say you want to know your attack surface, and you want to know what you want to know what you're exposing to the internet and your user base. And with that, you want to act accordingly. If you know you're running unsupported software but can't replace it, then it's a good idea to stick that in a sandbox to try and mitigate the risks. You want to incorporate security testing into your development cycles. If you're testing as you develop, then these security vulnerabilities get caught early on. And there's 2 main benefits behind this. That is that you learn about these vulnerabilities as you're developing, and you kind of know what to avoid as you continue to develop, and you kind of learn. And then there's also no security issues that will become deeply ingrained into your project, which become difficult to remove at late stages. And I would say finally to keep an eye on the news or software vendor websites for security advisories. You can always get an idea of the security issues to watch out for because they're really big news. A good example would be Log4Shell. And with that, I'm on to questions. So I'll pass it back to Georgie and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Tom. That was amazing. And I hope everybody that joined us this afternoon enjoyed that as well and found it useful. We've had a couple of questions come in throughout this afternoon's session. So I'm just going to ask those now. And as I say, if there's any more that come to mind after this or during the next couple of minutes, then feel free to fire them over. And if it's after the webinar, then you can get in touch with us on email and we'll make sure that they're answered as well. So first question, how can organizations ensure that they are aware every time a vulnerability opens up in their software?
So for software that they bought or is a product, I would say you want to be keeping an eye on news sources. You've got NIST, I can't remember what they stand for, but they're the guys that run the CVE project, or the software vendors themselves. By keeping an eye on them, you can kind of find out what's coming up. I think they also run mailing lists, but in cases where it's in-house software that you're running, then it's a bit more difficult. But I would say you want to be logging everything and running alerts, as they can be a big help to kind of indicate when something's going wrong.
I hope that answered that person's question. Second one, how can developers work patching into their dev cycles?
I'd say you want to be security testing in each development cycle. It's actually really a good example of what CST is handy for. Since we use the continuous testing, we can kind of work alongside the dev cycle. So let's say a client has just implemented some new technology, then we can test that new technology as they continue to develop and then feed that back to them, and it's kind of like a continuous cycle.
Thank you. And we've had a couple more come in now, actually. So Next one, what are some of the best websites to see the latest vulnerabilities?
I don't, besides NIST, because of the CV project, I don't think there's one specific good website. I just kind of keep an eye on the news. I think Twitter, you kind of see a lot of things come up when people have things they've been working on and they share it there. There's NIST, and just kind of general news sources is kind of where I go.
Great, thank you. I hope that answered that one. Any recommendations on patching vulnerable third-party products when the vendor isn't releasing patches, e.g. log4j embedded within a product? It's quite a lengthy question there, so if you want me to repeat it, I can.
No, that's a good question. In them sort of situations, it's kind of hard. If they're not releasing a fix for it, then I think that kind of becomes unsupported software. So I'd probably say, I mean, you could try and hack a fix, but I probably wouldn't, suggest that. I'd say if it's in that situation, it's kind of unsupported, and you'd ideally want to move on to a supported product. But if that's not possible, then you want to try and avoid having internet access to that, and you want to isolate that.
Okay, I think this is in reference to what you were discussing a moment ago. So it was, what about the best news sites? And I think that came in at the same time as, what are some of the best websites to see the latest vulnerabilities? So the question was, what about best news sites?
That is a question. I don't really have like best news sites. I just kind of, I think Twitter is a good example. You can kind of see what's happening on there, and then from that you can see what news sites people are using. I don't really have one specific news site. Although, Andreas or Laura, do you have any recommendations for news sites?
Yeah, I think there's a couple that you could definitely keep a look at. A load of them have RSS feeds that you can sign up to and kind of get like daily updates on things. So like the Hacker News is a really good one, and Dark Reading as well. They've got really cool articles about kind of the latest hacks going on and any new vulnerabilities that might be flying around the socials. As Tom mentioned, Twitter's really, really good. So I think it's just kind of, there's a good few main ones that you could have a look at, but as Tom's also touched on, there's so many different resources out there that you can kind of keep your ear to them all, and you'll end up kind of having a really good basis of what's going on in the industry.
We've had a couple of people messaging as well, just to say what they've found the best. We've got Bleeping Computer and Reddit as well. So those two are from other people on this session now. They've shared that they find those ones good sources for news. Okay, and then final question for now, but as I say, if there's any more, please do share them. Which vulnerability is overlooked in your opinion? Why should companies pay more attention to that?
I don't think there's any one specific vulnerability that's overlooked, but rather I'd say the medium and low impact vulnerabilities kind of don't seem to receive the attention that they should. Obviously, they have lower impacts, but then I also think they're more likely to be exploited. So I think they should kind of receive the same attention towards being fixed as the higher impact ones too, just because they are more likely to be exploited. And I think the exploitation rate here is kind of not really appreciated or really talked about. And there's also kind of the idea that these could be chained together to then create high impact that I don't think many people consider either.
Thank you, Tom. I know there was quite a few questions there, so thank you to everybody that shared those in. And as I say, if there are any more that spring to mind after this in the next couple of days, weeks, or whatever, please just pop them on an email and we'll make sure that Tom and the team get back to you to help you out there as well. I think that looks like there's no more come in now, so just thank you to everybody for joining this afternoon, and thank you for Tom for that really insightful webinar. and you'll all be able to download all of the slides from this afternoon session. So if there's anything you wanted to look back over, find out more information about, you can use all of the slides that Tom shared today. And also a recording will be sent out to you in the next couple of days. Oh, we've just had a couple more questions come in. So as we've got a little bit of time, I'm just going to ask those to you now, sorry. Can you tell us more about CST, Tom?
Yeah, so CST is continuous security testing. And the idea behind it is that we are just, well, continuously testing. I think it stands out more from traditional penetration testing, because a penetration test is like a point in time test, whereas continuous security testing, we're continually testing your environment. Any changes, we notice them, we can test them. And I also think that there is an aspect of there's kind of like a thing where people say that hackers can have unlimited time if they really want to get into something. And I don't think that is something that's considered with a traditional pen test, because you have limited time. But then with CST, because we're continuously testing, we kind of get to learn your environment more, and we get to utilize that time more than, say, a traditional pen test, if that answers your question.
Hopefully that does answer the question. And then in response to somebody else, can you send out a list of the websites you mentioned? Yeah, absolutely. We've got your email address, so we'll send those directly. And we'll also share them in the email after this with the recording and the slides, just for a bit more information. Right, thank you everybody for joining this afternoon. And as I say, any more questions that do spring up over the next week or so, or a couple of days, just fire them over and we'll make sure that the team get back to you. Thanks for your time, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.